Welcome to Sociology 102, Police Violence, Black Lives Matter, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm your instructor, Professor Wary, and today I'm joined by Thenjiwe McHarris, a strategist at the Movement for Black Lives, and by Philip McHarris, a PhD candidate in the Sociology Department at Yale. I've known Phil for a while. I just met Thenjiwe, and so I'm really excited to have this conversation. And so we've decided that we're going to be Fred, Thenjiwe, and Phil for this conversation. So first with Thenjiwe, please tell us about the movement for Black Lives and how it emerged.
Sure. And thanks for having me. It's very exciting to share some stuff with you, and particularly my very brilliant brother. So people do often ask, what is the movement for Black Lives? And I just want to say a couple of things. It emerged in 2014, particularly late 2014, where across the country, across the country, we had and saw uprisings from Ferguson in St. Louis, Missouri, to New York, to Atlanta, to across the country. And the Movement for Black Lives wanted to create, was an attempt to create a space for organizations across the country to be in shared struggle together, to think about what does this moment mean in sort of the long arc of Black liberation? How do we engage in a coordinated way, particularly in such a decentralized moment in terms of the mobilizations that we're seeing across the country. But really it was a space that we could assess the current political moment together, that we can develop shared strategy, and that we could also be in real struggle and debate so that we can lift up the most transformative demands of our time that really spoke to sort of the urgency of the moment, but also the demands of our people. And so M4BL is what we call it is a movement infrastructure for organizations across the country. We started with about 7 organizations. Now we're about 150, from base building to local to national. And we are a site where we lift up demands. We engage in mass mobilization efforts, but then we also move collective direct action across the country. So that's M4BL. And I also just want to say M4BL falls in sort of the tradition of Black movement, from generation to generation. So we really see ourselves as really standing on the shoulders of our elders and our ancestors, who really understood that there are things that we could only do together that would be otherwise impossible to do alone.
And one of the things that I think is not surprising, but not often remarked upon, is just how a lot of the questions and issues we're talking about today with policing and thinking about sort of the value of Black lives, these are conversations that have happened for quite some time. And I'm remembering that Phil has written a bit about the problems of policing since the days of Lyndon B. Johnson. And so we remember LBJ for sort of signing the Civil Rights Act, but we don't talk as much about how he then, a year later, has to declare war on crime and feels he has to declare it. And why does this matter? Why do we need to think about LBJ and his declaration of a war on crime as we think about policing today?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So when we think about the development of policing and police power over time, the 1960s is one of these periods that we have to look at for the origins of sort of this large scale expansion to what I refer to as mass policing, as it's been come to know today. But just some numbers over time. So in 1960, the United States spent about $2 billion on policing across the country. In 1980, the number went up to 14.6 billion. In 2000, the number was 67 billion. And in 2018, the number had toppled $137 billion. So something, got us from 2 billion to 137 billion. And largely, one of the sort of early moments that we can look to is the 1960s, when it was this period of racial progress in some regards. But at the same time, there was this carceral backlash that we see, that the United States, from local, state, and federal levels, sought to increase their capacity to engage in policing and carceral control. And that was largely directly in response to the uprising and rebellions and larger movement that was going on at the time. And so, Lyndon B. Johnson, who Elizabeth Hinton writes extensively about, Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 declares this war on crime, and relatedly launches this Law Enforcement Assistance Act. So before this point, there was no large-scale federal mechanism for funding policing around the country. But after this developed and created this new availability of funds that all levels of law enforcement were able to tap into. And Johnson himself says, we want the local law enforcement officer to be the frontline soldier in this war on crime. And really what this ends up doing is creating this federal pathway to fund and expand policing. But that it didn't just stop there. What that did is it created this link that started to develop. But this link between policing and public safety is a relatively new one. For most of the history of policing, police weren't seen as the stewards in this sort of legitimate apparatus that is responsible for public safety. They were seen as tools of control, and largely institutions that were filled with corruption. But this sort of begins to crystallize this professionalization and shift towards creating policing as this sort of front-facing stewards of public safety, and local and state governments followed. And so this is the way that the federal government not only creates and channels resources, but it also shifts paradigms and creates policy shifts that then ripple across the country. And so then in the coming decades, we see this large-scale expansion of policing that rests on this idea that police equal public safety. And what we see is that even when you look at the data, that all of this money, there's no, direct or easily discernible correlation between this large-scale increase and any real decreases in what's reported as violence or what's referred to as crime, because we know what's referred to as crime is what's criminalized and often who is criminalized. But it's critical because this period begins this large-scale expansion of policing and police power, which is what has paved the way in many ways for accelerated and increased levels of police violence and police harm, as well as mass incarceration and carceral harm.
Yeah, which leads me to the next question. So Thenjiwe, if we were to imagine what could have happened, what we could have declared instead of a war on crime, what might that have been?
I feel like this is such an important question. When you think about LBJ's war on crime and Trump's Operation Legend, it's really important for us to think about what should have happened then so that we can situate ourselves in what we should be demanding now. I mean, you had LBJ call for a war on poverty and a war on crime at the same time. When sometimes war on crime ends up targeting the poor. So it's like it's such a contradiction, and it shows sort of the lack of political will to really address the issues of poverty, but also sort of like the historical trauma and impact of anti-Black racism in this country, and the need to really invest in powerful ways to restore, heal, and provide Black people across the country, working class people across the country, what they need to be able to not just survive, but be able to live in dignity and create healthy families and healthy communities. And so while we pride, FDR, while we pride sort of what LBJ did in terms of, great society at times of the Civil Rights Act, what we see though is that that did not go far enough to meet the needs of Black people. And then for LBJ then to call for a war on crime, what we saw was a celebrating of a president that really created significant harm to Black communities and paved the way to what we see now, which is hyper policing, militarized policing, and this country choosing to always deal with societal problems with a gun or a cage. And I think now is time that we learn from what happened in the 60s. That did not work. Our communities are still hurting, and policing don't provide safety. So what do we need now? We need this country to really show in ways that it values life, it values Black life by how it spends its money. And this is obviously, this is about defund the police, is about policing and the criminal justice system, but it's even bigger than that. It's about how we spend money in this country. It's about what we prioritize in this country. And what we need is a drastic divestment and a defunding of the systems and institutions that harm our people. And we need an investment in what our communities need: quality housing, quality education, quality healthcare in meaningful ways that goes deeper than what we've seen. And I just also want to say before I stop is we can't forget that during that time where LBJ is calling for a war on crime, there's also the Vietnam War. So there's waging war at home on Black people, and there's waging war on people around the world. And we would be remiss if we didn't see some of the similarities happening in this moment now. And so I think this is a moment that we articulate the demands that we know that not just we deserve right now, but decades from now, I want our children's children to be talking about that we did everything we can to disrupt them trying to pave the way so that they would have to live under conditions that we're living now or potentially even worse.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as I listen to you about the language of war. So when I hear the word war, it tells me that there is an enemy. And in this case, the enemy is sort of on our soil kind of thing. And the things that you can do to an enemy are very different than the things that you would do to a family member or a community member who just sort of had somehow, maybe had broken some rules and needed to be brought back into community somehow. And so I think one of the things that's striking is just this language of war and warfare, and therefore the tools that are appropriate for war and warfare. And so as I'm thinking about this language of war and getting away from war, it then brings us to this question of solutions. So if our solutions are not the solutions of war, then what are they? And given that there have been a lot of different solutions put out there, some of them, I read some of your work, and some of them, both of you have talked about false solutions. And so can you walk us through solutions that might sound fine on their face, but you think are just not good ones, and other solutions that we're not talking about enough?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the reform era of policing, as it's commonly referred to, begins in the early 1900s. And so these reforms have largely focused on trainings, and then later, as time has gone on, things like technology, body cameras, things like de-escalation training and implicit bias training, early response prevention programs for what they refer to as problem officers, and it runs the gambit. But so when we think around also community policing and officer diversity are two of the ones that emerged as big, reforms, especially coming out of the 1960s. And the this community policing framework actually emerges in the 70s. And this was ends up becoming, something that politicians continuously and police continuously go back to even today, despite the past 50 years showing that has not stopped police violence or, made communities safer. And largely it becomes a tool of public relations in many ways to maintain or to try to maintain or build the legitimacy of policing, particularly in moments when the fundamental legitimacy of the institution of policing is in question. And so, and when we think about the community policing framework that emerged in the 1970s, this was at the same time that the war on drugs and subsequently, the war on basically all social ills begins to take place and mass incarceration takes off. And so what we see is that policing as a system inevitably ends up adapting in the broader criminal legal system to basically appease and pacify people who are angry around violence at the same time that that policing and incarceration is expanding. And so when we think around false solutions, I think that the key things to remember are false solutions are initiatives, programs, strategies, tactics that do nothing to transform the actual conditions and the actual systems, and that oftentimes they focus on individuals and officer compliance with certain rules or certain mandates. And they focus on things like diversity and community policing, which actually doesn't shift or transform anything. What it inevitably does is it creates a sort of veneer to help pacify in moments that doesn't actually shift or change anything. And yeah, so I think the when we think around solutions, the problem in many ways today is that for social problems, social ills, when people engage in rebellion and uprising and resistance against unjust conditions, the response is always policing and carceral solutions, right? And so, so there's an issue, call the police, incarcerate, and really what undergirds this is an obsession with punishment and control. That is what undergirds this entire criminal legal system, is that something happens, if you want someone to do something or if you want something to stop, just throw control, vengeance, retribution, punishment at the problem, and then that will make it go away. And that's what, in many ways, the parallels that we see today is, people are, rebelling across the country because people want, just communities that have resources that they need to live and thrive and not have to be subjected to violence and police violence. And the response is, we need to up policing and we need to incarcerate the people and we need to criminalize the people resisting. And even when we see at protests around the country, we see police becoming violent towards protesters while they're protesting police violence. That the response is still this, we need to throw policing, we need to throw carceral solutions. And even, some of the major solutions from politicians is let's give police more money to implement these trainings that have been recycled for decades and have not stopped police violence. And I think the main thing here is the kinds of solutions that are valuable are the kinds of solutions that are aimed at dramatically reducing police power and resources towards developing community institutions and resources and alternatives to emergency response. Because police not only actively harm particular communities, particularly Black communities as well as other marginalized communities, they also get in the way, in a part of this broader criminal legal system, of actually developing systems of safety and accountability that are rooted in frameworks that can actually stop and end cycles of violence and harm. They end up basically exacerbating and creating more cycles in other forms of cycles and harm, as opposed to thinking about frameworks like transformative justice and restorative justice as sort of seeds that can begin to help us, think about a new imagined public safety. And the last piece around that I'll mention around this is that, in the social sciences, one of the things that we, the sort of, when we think about designing a study or designing a project is, first, what is the question? And then let the methodology be driven by whatever the question is, whatever makes sense to best answer that question, right? And so if the question here is, how do we create a safer place and safe and accountable communities, then how do we start from there and begin designing ways and responses to violence and harm and conflict that make the most sense, that can actually center safety and accountability? But that's not what happens, which is similar to having a method that you throw at every single question, right? It's, how do we want safety? How do we fix the problems of policing? As opposed to saying, policing is creating a lot of problems. and it doesn't solve the problems that it purports to say that it tries to solve. So what does it look like if we care about public safety to reimagine how we conceive of and develop preventative measures, safety interventions, and responses to violence, conflict, and harm once it happens? And a lot of that, a lot of what, we know this from decades of research, is that if communities have their basic needs met, it reduces the things that lead to violence and conflict and harm. And also, that doesn't mean that it will end it or stop it, but that also means that we can develop alternatives, and very real things that we actually do know create safer communities. Things like violence interruption that is community based, green spaces, conflict resolution teams, and we can have experiments for what doesn't exist and scale up what we do know does work and does exist, to really reimagine public safety, as opposed to starting from the premise that if we want public safety, we need policing and we need to figure out how to fix policing. But, a part of this is that, a question of, again, taking a step back and really seeing that we have to decenter policing from this larger vision of public safety.
And Thenjiwe, what comes to mind for you in terms of good solutions versus false solutions?
Sure. When I think about false solutions, I think about, especially in an era where we're talking about policing and criminal justice, I think about two things that false solutions end up doing. Because in moments of like that we're in now, people are thinking about two things. One is it's like how to reduce the suffering, like how to in material ways make sure that Black people in our community are not targeted, harassed, criminalized, killed, caged by the police. It's actually reducing the suffering. It's harm mitigation. And then the other one is whether or not people use this word or not is actually transformation. People are looking for structural transformation. People want access to be able to provide for themselves and their families what they need and not have to be afraid and to have access to safety. So what they're asking for is like structural and cultural shifts that allow us to live in a society that is far better than what it is now. And what false solutions end up doing is it doesn't speak to the issue of suffering, and it distracts from structural and cultural shifts that are necessary. And obviously, body cameras are often used as one example. Body cameras sort of obviously has been surfaced for years, but in 2014, in the midst of the uprisings, one of the main sort of solutions that was sort of a across the aisle easy solution was body cameras. And I always say to comrades and other organizers, like, we have to beware of easy victories that are across the aisle. Any meaningful shifts are going to be something that we fought like hell for. And body cameras is an example, because what it did was it sort of created the illusion to many people that it would reduce the suffering, and also may even allow for some shifts that the ways in which policing would interact with community members might shift. But what we all know is that it didn't. And what it also did, it not only dealt with the harm and also the distracted from the actual structural shifts that needs to happen in our country, it also created avenues for additional surveillance of our communities and with data that we don't have any sort of control over. So that's what I mean about beware of false solutions, because they actually can create more harm than good, no matter sort of what the illusion or PR around it is. And of course, we know there's other false solutions as well. But what good solutions are is ones that there's this false dichotomy of what people need now and long-term structural change. That's a false dichotomy. We are like very nuanced human beings. We can deal with how do we reduce the suffering in this moment while we move towards the actual structural transformative change that we need. And there are ways in which that we can have actual solutions that can allow for us to hold both at the same time. And I think this is a moment where we're saying, we call for defund the police. We're calling for divestment from policing and investment in our communities, because we're saying now's the time that we can actually do some harm mitigation very quickly. We can invest in our communities. And as we do that, we need to culturally have people really hold on to. The fact that is policing really providing the safety that people need? Like, what is policing really doing? And then living in in a place of possibility and imagination where we know that we can fight for what we deserve, and that what we actually want isn't something that is impossible. We can create more avenues to safety while investing in our communities. Everybody deserves safety. What we're saying is now we have to invest in the actual infrastructure. We have to invest in the actual mechanisms that will allow for all people to be safe. And we can do it. It's actually like the most practical thing we can do in this moment is begin those investments while we continue to limit police power. And now we need to talk about the power at the federal level in our communities, but we have to limit powers, in drastic ways right now to do harm mitigation and protect our people while we fight for investments in our communities and investments in alternatives so that decades from now, just like we're talking about 1965, what I think about my responsibility is in 2035 or 2045, what I don't want is to be living in the same moment where we're talking about the issue of policing. I want them looking back at the infrastructures that were created over the past decades that they have access to, that are allowing them to actually have access to what they need in moments of crisis and what they deserve in moments of emergency. And that's what I want to see decades from now. And those, for me, is us paving the way for actual good solutions.
Yeah, I think several things that struck me. I mean, on the one hand, the things that sound easy and that sound really straightforward aren't always so straightforward. I remember sort of the discussion of de-escalation training, and then you both pointed out that Minneapolis they have de-escalation training, and so we talk about cameras, but then you can't get access to what's on the cameras. And so there are all these ways in which sometimes you can kind of get some solutions that sound as if they're going to work, but the other thing I also wanted to sort of flag here is just how much policing is taking up of our city budgets. I saw estimates from the both of you of 30 to 50% of city budgets.
So I think in terms of when people hear defunding, a part of what is sometimes not seen is that it's a part of a broader strategy of invest, divest, and that defunding is not about defunding, and relatedly, abolition is not about defunding or abolishing safety and health. It's actually about creating mechanisms and systems for safety that actually can keep everybody safe and that don't come, with violence and harm and terror associated with it. And so, one thing as a thought experiment is what kinds of responses and teams and systems does it make sense to respond to particular threats to safety, right? And so a community can literally go down a list of everything that makes a community feel unsafe and ask what makes the most sense in terms of a way of responding to this specific situation. What are those teams or responses? What should they look like? What kinds of resources and tools might they need to have? What kinds of support, pathways might they need to have? Who do they might need to be in conversation with? What are plans to keep those providing safety safe? And I think that there's a way of asking that question and developing teams and responses to respond to every single situation with the aim of safety and accountability, and making sure whatever the safety threat is managed in the quickest amount of time possible. That does not look like this current model of policing, and actually the system of policing doesn't make sense as a model for responding to a wide variety of threats and situations, you know, and just to sort of to flag as well is that safety was policing was never designed for public safety. You know, when we think about the emergence of policing, whether it's in the South as slave patrols, in the West, you know, in terms of Texas Rangers and the colonial project of expanding the country, or in the North in the 1800s, where shippers and merchants were able to convince governments that it was in their interest to have publicly funded police to protect the interests of capital and shippers, that the system was never actually designed for public safety. And so the violence that we see today is part and parcel of the fact that policing emerged as a tool of race and class control. And the reason why it has not created the safety that the resources, you know, if it was actually designed in a way that was centered on public safety, should have created, is because the model, again, if we think back to this question of how to design a response that makes sense for the specific question, if we're thinking about public safety, it doesn't make sense, this current model. And so, you know, what safety and what this, you know, broader project of investing and divesting looks like is not about not having anyone to call. It's about having someone to call that actually makes the most sense, and having a response that doesn't cause you more harm in the process. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my brother said it all, so I really don't have much to add. I'll just say it's a scare tactic. It's a scare tactic that we can't let win. When we say defund the police, or when we say an abolition to police, the approach from the right, and sometimes from the center, or someone who's in opposition with that, is to say, oh, well, then that means that they don't want anyone to have any access to safety. It's just not true. What we're saying is that this country has never really invested in public safety, like not really. So that we live in a society where policing is used for every single crisis, every single emergency, and the impact that that's having on our communities is more violence, more harm, and an inability to actually remedy so many issues that our people deserve to have some access to remedy or support or care, and we just don't have it. And so I think our counter to that is, think about what safety should actually be like, so that it's not just white people living in a particular wealthy suburb that has access to safety, but like, what could safety actually look like for all people? And let's think about what that looks like, whether it is an actual violence that's happening, or mental health crisis, or some sort of abuse, like the various different needs and crises that people have. What would actually make people have access to actual safety and care? And I find it very challenging for anyone to give an answer that it's policing, because it's not. So it's not going to be policing. Policing does not offer an access to safety and care for the range of crises and emergencies that people have, and in fact has added more harm. So I think I want people to think about, like, what would if you had an emergency, think about the ranges of it. What would safety actually look like? And I think what the response might be, well, I would want someone who is trained to know how to deal with that particular crisis. And then we say, okay, great. So we need to make sure that people have access to people that are trained to deal with that particular crisis, when that they are there, and that there's ways in which people can reach them in moments of crisis and emergencies. The other thing that I also want us to talk about, and Philip and I wrote a piece about this, is everybody deserves a place to go to when they need help. And then they deserve someone on the other line that's willing and able and ready to support them. And so what we're saying is, let's build it. Let's build out an infrastructure. So when there is a mental health crisis, there is a trained person to support. When there's an issue of homelessness, there is someone trained to support. If there's an issue of abuse, there is someone trained to intervene and support. Let's build it, and let's not limit our idea of what's possible so much so that we block out what we actually really need and what's going to set up future generations for success. And I would just say, just that moment that we get afraid that what this would mean is a lack of safety and fear and horror and all of that, just know that that's a fear tactic. And this is not the first time that fear tactic has been deployed by those in positions of power. Throughout history, whenever people have demanded structural change for the benefit of humanity and the planet, there has always been the opposition that communicated or encouraged a level of fear that is just not true and does not speak to what people are actually demanding and calling for. What we're saying is that what we're actually calling for is actual safety. What people who are fighting for in terms of protecting the sanctity of policing, for investing in policing, what they're fighting for is actually more harm, more violence, and moving us in a direction away from the actual structural change that we need.
Yeah, definitely echo everything. And I think a part of what Thenjiwe mentioned, just to echo as well, is that kind of fear tactic has been very popular, especially at the presidential level, as well as at all levels of government, around this sort of soft on crime and sort of playing into these ideas around like safety and these sorts of fear tactics. And we see this with Michael Dukakis, in 1988. We see this with Bill Clinton pushing this sort of tough on crime platform. And, we see this at all levels of government, where basically, for the past 60 years, if you do not advocate for more policing and more resources for police, you get painted as soft on crime and that you don't care about safety. And that is one of the mechanisms by which, from liberals and conservatives, how there's been alignment around expanding policing and carceral control. It is this idea around playing with this idea around safety, which has this historical legacy. And I think, So just to talk about in terms of my experiences around being trained as a sociologist, and then how it relates to, this dimension around police violence. And, I think, at least for me, from when I started grad school, these questions around policing became very central to sort of my research agenda and what, I wanted to understand, which is, in many ways, it relates to me, having experienced policing and police, in terms of police violence, and seeing it, I think, what sociology has helped me do is in terms of giving me tools and resources and methods to be able to unpack and understand policing from various different perspectives. And, basically I've spent the past 6 years really digging into this question around policing, as well as related questions around, what safety looks like, housing, and what it looks like to meet the basic needs of communities. But I think, at least for me, sociology has given me sets of questions and methods to be able to really sort of think about, analyze, and really consider what is the history of policing, what is the function of policing today, and specifically thinking around a systems and structural approach, as opposed to sort of looking at individuals in bad or good apples, but thinking about larger and broader structures. And, I think specifically there's a few things that it's lended itself to that has been helpful, as, for me, as I think through some of these different things. And, I think one big thing is around socialization and the criminal legal system as a socializer. And, one of the things that sort of comes up in my own research is around, there are sometimes cases where people who might experience police violence, or who are communities who are targeted by police violence, when posed with the question of, how do you want to make your community safer? There are times where people, might say, well, maybe we want more policing. But the reason, and this is, again, if we take a step back, is that for the entirety of people's lives, they're told that police are the providers of public safety, even when people know that it doesn't make sense. And so when you're faced with the option of, do nothing, or this idea around this, the providers of public safety, even when that doesn't feel true, are not going to be there. Oftentimes people might say, you know what, we don't, we want policing because people associate police with public safety, which again is a relatively new concept and is many ways a product of socialization from all different sorts of institutions, from the criminal legal system to, to various other institutions in society, that really socialize people into this idea that this model of what is referred to as safety is the best and the only real way for communities to be safe. But, and this is something that I've employed in my own work, is if you ask people, do you want to defund or get rid of the police? Some people might say no, right? Because we want safety. But if you ask, do you want to defund the police and develop new systems and strategies and teams to respond to individual particular crises that have the necessary and requisite training to best help you in that situation? In addition to funding things like schools and hospitals, and programs to eradicate poverty and guaranteeing housing and ending eviction, and making sure people have the resources that they need to meet their basic needs, would you be in support of that? And that's a different question. But a part of this, what people often do is they ask, and this is in some ways related to, sometimes in sociology, at times, it can be sort of, well, if you shift this one thing, right? When we think of statistical designs, if you shift this one factor, what kind of marginal effects will happen? So if you take away policing, or if you shift, this, or what will happen, as opposed to thinking from a structural perspective, what happens if we change everything, right? And I think, relatedly, what's key here, and just to bring in Du Bois, who, was critical of the convict leasing system as it was emerging after the fall of slavery as a tool to recreate a system that can, exploit Black labor. But really, drawing on Angela Davis here, what I think to bring in is this concept that Du Bois had of abolition democracy. And Du Bois was very critical of seeing the abolition of slavery as just a negative process, as just removing and tearing something down, right? And, he was critical of that. And what he argued is that the abolition, and he talked about this in the context of slavery, but the abolition of slavery requires creating democratic and just institutions that can then give Black people the resources and tools that they need to thrive and really live full lives that is not, plagued by violence and premature death and exploitation. And so Du Bois had this perspective and this framework of abolition democracy as not only tearing down things that are oppressive, but also building up new democratic, just, and what Ruth Wilson Gilmore would describe as life-affirming institutions. And I think I think I've been thinking a lot about Du Bois in these weeks. And I think, thinking around this whole broader project around defunding and abolition as one, a democratic process, but not only taking something away, but the real, that being an initial process into creating new. Because what Du Bois argued is that if you only remove and take away and abolish oppressive systems in the context of slavery, what you will find is the recreation of systems that are fundamentally based on oppressive conditions, and that will recreate systems of bondage and exploitation and oppression in various forms. And I think that's key here. When we're thinking about all this. And lastly, I think specifically around when we think of models and statistics, what I think is really important, especially when we think around like the social sciences, are the ways in which statistics are often used to undercut or, they're selectively used to make certain arguments. So, for example, recently, because of protests, there are some political leaders and some, entities that are saying, okay, well, this is happening because of these, violence is increasing because of protest, or things are increasing because people are. And I think getting out of this framework of thinking, like being backward looking or making this loose, these loose arguments, because oftentimes this is what happens is, statistics are often used in effort to legitimizing systems and practices and institutions that are very harmful. And this is something that I think, I've been grateful in terms of sociology, is to be able to, look into, read, understand, and push back against things that are legitimizing or structuring something. And in many ways, we see this with, as we were talking about earlier, with false solutions, right? Is that oftentimes, we see these studies that say, okay, if you implement this, this might reduce this particular kind of police violence, because we know most people who experience police violence, don't report it. And, the vast majority of the kinds of police violence we will never actually be able to really capture, both in terms of the direct violence, but also the kinds of structural violence that occur that you can't really, you can't really take stock of in the ways that would really give justice to the kinds of violence and harm that people really experience from policing. And so, I think specifically is around this piece is just thinking about how the ways in which statistics in social sciences, oftentimes can be used to serve as legitimizing factors, as opposed to thinking about how we can really think and reimagine, and specifically this, the reason why marginal effects and these kinds of designs and linear models that try to predict this doesn't work is because this broader project of invest, divest, or, and more broadly, and relatedly abolition, it's not about changing a few things and seeing what ends up. It's about changing everything. And I think that's really important to consider it and really hold.
Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. Really appreciate it. I know that everyone here doesn't agree with everything that you've said, and that is never the case when talking about really important issues. But I ask that anyone who's heard this conversation listen to it carefully. So it doesn't matter when we don't agree. What matters is that we understand. And I think what you've done is really helped us to sort of see it from a perspective that a lot of people just don't have that perspective because they don't have that experience to have that perspective. And so I'm really grateful for you both. And thank you so much, so much.
Thank you, Fred.
Thanks for having us. Bye.